Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.
Hey Jen, good to be talking to you today again on Maritime Matters. We are recording on Friday the 3rd of May around lunchtime. So what's been keeping you busy this week, Jen? I noticed you had a piece out in the AFR. What were you talking about there?
Hey Richard, great to chat, and good to be on our 3rd episode now of Maritime Matters. And thanks for the shameless plug of my Fin Review piece, which if you don't have access to the Fin Review, will be on my website in the next 24 hours. So another shameless plug, keep an eye out for it. So basically it talks about the capability gap in the surface combatant fleet. So as much as we've had a lot of fanfare about the doubling of the surface combatant fleet for the Royal Australian Navy, although I would contest it's not doubling, I wouldn't count the large optionally crewed surface vessels as a frigate or destroyer. But anyway, the fact is that it's kind of glossed over the issue that we only have 11 surface combatants now. On the 17th of May, that will be 10, and it effectively is now 10 when HMAS Anzac commissions, and in 2026, that will be 9 when HMAS Arunta commissions. And although we're getting the new general purpose frigate, which we'll talk about a bit later about who might build that, realistically, the first of those is not coming till probably 2029. The schedule isn't out for that. We are expecting a shipbuilding schedule this year. I've heard some people say maybe 2 by the 2030s, but I think that's probably optimistic. So that means that for this significant period until the end of the 2020s, we actually have less major surface combatants that we've pretty much ever had in our naval history. So what my Fin Review piece was talking about is how do we then get the most out of the ships we have? How do we increase their operational readiness? How do we look at their preparedness? And really, I propose 2 elements. One is looking at forward basing of one of our frigates. Now, everybody will say, well, that's too hard. But it's not too hard, and other countries have done it. So, yes, we know that the UK has 2 Royal Navy offshore patrol vessels based in Singapore, which will be replaced by Type 31s in the near future, once they're built. And they have a Type 23, right? So HMS Lancaster, based out of Bahrain in the Middle East. HMS Lancaster was commissioned in 92. She's an old ship as well, right? But they've managed to do it. So I think that we should look at options. Now, where would we base that ship? Singapore seems the obvious option because we already have a logistics footprint from there. And, you know, when we have issues with a ship up in the South China Sea, we get the parts through Singapore. Yokosuka in Japan, I didn't mention in my article, but I think that could be a good option. Or potentially in the Philippines, which is probably the least preferred option. The second thing I look at is if we want to increase the operational availability of these ships. Now, yes, you're going to have to wear some risk in sustainment, et cetera, but also you need to address the crews. So what the UK do with HMS Lancaster in Bahrain is they rotate a new crew out every 4 months. Now, Australia has considered this. It has done it for its minor war vessels and actually trialled it for its frigates. In fact, I was in the Middle East in 2008 when we trialled flexi crewing. There's a lot of pros and cons, right? And people will be very quick to throw up the reasons why we can't do it. But if we come back to the core issue of the government is talking about we are in one of the most concerning strategic periods of our time. They've talked about how important the maritime is. You know, 38% of the IIP is going towards the maritime domain in the next 10 years. And yet we have the least capable Navy we've had in over 50 years. Now, people might debate about capability, right? But in terms of quantity, which, you know, has a quality all of its own, we will have 9 ships. So I think we need to look at that, look at crewing and look at forward basing.
Moving on, talking about what's been going on in the region this week. What's been sort of immediately grabbed your attention? There's been a fair bit of news. So what's top of the billing?
Yeah, look, there has been a fair bit of news. I think a quick one. We spoke last week a lot about the Western Pacific Naval Symposium. It occurred last week in China. We talked about it extensively. And there's been reporting that's come out this week, or at least a statement, it sounds like, reporting from the ABC, that the Australian Chief of Navy actually had a bilateral with the head of the Chinese Navy, which you'd expect, and raised the incident in November last year where HMAS Toowoomba was harassed by a PLA destroyer and some of her divers were injured. So I thought that was interesting reporting. Does it mean much? No. Will it change much? No. But I think the positive thing is it's good to see that the two heads of navies are talking, and communication is pretty critical right now.
What's else happening in the region? Most notably, of course, another incident involving in the South China Sea between Philippines and Chinese vessels. This one is on Scarborough Shoal. A lot of the attention recently has been on Second Thomas Shoal. So there was a joint Philippines Coast Guard and Philippines Bureau of Fisheries and Resources mission to resupply fishers on Scarborough Shoal. They were harassed in much the same way that these vessels have been for some time, and potentially even to sort of a greater extent than we've seen, including ramming and being hit with water cannons. At one stage, there were up to 10 Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels harassing these two Philippines ships. So obviously this fits into a much wider pattern. I think it should be noted that the Philippines made it clear that the mission was successful. They did manage to conduct the resupply. I think it was probably fair to say it was successful in other ways. One of the things that was quite notable again was the pretty strong condemnation of Chinese actions from a wide range of different parties immediately afterwards. And that was not in any way hindered by the fact that on board one of the Philippines vessels was, in this case, a BBC crew with film and camera. And so this policy that the Philippines have been adopting of sort of transparency and trying to really reveal what it is that's happening out on the water, I think is bearing fruit. It's good to see. Whether it changes Chinese actions is obviously a different question, but I think it's really revealing the true extent of what is happening out on the South China Sea. What did you make of this, Jen? Of course, Scarborough Shoal is a really important sort of flashpoint in some ways. So this is a sort of important position from that kind of respect as well.
Yeah, absolutely right. So I guess when I think about it, a lot of people might be getting sick of seeing lots of photos of water cannoning, and they think it's becoming the norm. Which we're going to go to the boiling frog analogy that Commander Indo Paycom, who hands over today, used this week, because I think it's relevant to that. But I think in terms of Scarborough Shoal, in some ways, and I'm not an expert on this, but Scarborough Shoal seems to be the most important flashpoint in the Philippines exclusive economic zone. And the history of Scarborough Shoal is pretty important. So in 2012, there was a significant standoff between China and the Philippines over Scarborough Shoal. And the US actually got China and the Philippines to go to the table and have negotiations around it. Now, that was significant. Now, obviously, 12 years later, that would never happen. But at the time, it did. The Philippines' understanding of the outcome of that negotiations, which took a couple of months or something like that, was that both the Philippines and China would withdraw their ships from Scarborough Shoal. So the Philippines did, but China didn't. And effectively, China then took control of Scarborough Shoal. So it's a sensitive point for the US. In 2016, there were rumors that China planned to militarize Scarborough Shoal. And when you look at the islands they have militarizing Scarborough Shoal would be fantastic in terms of achieving their bastion planning, right? Like it's so much further north than the Spratlys. It really does start to enclose the entire South China Sea. In 2016, when the US caught wind of this, they put a lot of pressure on China, a lot of military rotation through the Philippines, and we don't use the term red line these days, but it indicated to China that it would be a step too far. And China didn't militarize Scarborough Shoal, unlike what it had done in the Spratlys. So this one is a really sensitive one. Now, there is this group in the Philippines called the Alton Group. It's a civil group that are planning a resupply mission to the fishermen around Scarborough Shoal in 2 weeks. And I think this is going to flare up again. It will be really interesting where the US has been able to stand back around Second Thomas Shoal. If this continues to escalate around Scarborough Shoal, I don't think they will be able to. And there is a precedence there for 2016. So I think this is one to watch. And in many ways, it is one that could escalate well beyond where we're at with Second Thomas Shoal.
Yeah, concerning times. Also in the South China Sea region, we saw some reporting about a Chinese spy vessel sort of operating in the region and following around vessels involved in exercise Balikatan. No real surprise there. I wondered what's your take on this, because I have my own quite clear and strong views on this. So I'll see what you think, and then I'll come back and say my bit.
You know, I think it's interesting. It's amusing. I'm not sure why it's still reported on that much, to be honest. I mean, countries do spy on each other's naval exercises. That is a thing. China is not the only country that does it. They're perhaps the only country that does it so overtly. But they've been doing this for a long time. You know, there was a lot of ruckus in Australia last year when there was a Chinese spy ship in the Australian exclusive economic zone around Talisman Sabre. And there's no reason that you're not allowed to operate your spy ship in somebody else's EEZ, right? There's no rule against that. In fact, you know, I read something today that, you know, in 2014 at RIMPAC exercise in Hawaii, where China was invited, and again, 10 years ago, different times, they sent their ships and they also sent their spy ships. So, look, I think it's interesting, it's amusing, but it's to be expected, and I don't think too much more of it than that. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I have kind of issues to a degree with the way a lot of these things are reported, and particularly when they get picked up by politicians and used in that kind of way. I am very much of the view that the rules apply to both sides, and we are trying to be quite explicit about upholding a rules-based international order. However you want to frame it, we need to acknowledge that we have to respect those rules and very much be seen to do so. And so actually I thought it was really good to see that both spokesmen from both the Philippines and the American militaries came out and said, yeah, nothing's going. Of course they are. They're not interfering, doing anything they shouldn't be doing, so they're kind of very welcome. And I think that's definitely the spirit in which we should be viewing this. You've already mentioned briefly the boiling frog analogy. So do you want to explain to our readers a little bit more about this?
Yeah, right. So Admiral Aquilino, so the outgoing commander of Indo-PACOM for the US, who actually hands over today on the 3rd of May. You're probably not watching this on the 3rd of May, but he's handing over on the 3rd of May to Admiral Paparo, the previous commander of PAC Fleet. He gave an interview where he described the South China Sea as a boiling frog scenario, which I thought was great, because I swear I did that about 10 years ago. In fact, I'm going to find the reference and put it in the show notes.
I'm sure he copied you, right?
Yeah, I'm sure he had heard of Jen Parker 10 years ago. But anyway, or now. But he was saying that, you know, as much as there is a narrative that relationships with China are improving in some ways, you know, in Australia we're seeing this whole stabilization narrative. In the US, at least, there are talks again between Chinese military hierarchy and political hierarchy with the US, right? So communications are increasing. But he said, despite that, you're seeing increased pressure in, you know, the South China Sea, in East Asia, from the Chinese military, and that's increased Coast Guard deployments, use of maritime militia. When you look at the Taiwan Strait, you know, before 2022, it was quite significant if you'd see Chinese aircraft or ships crossing the median line in the Taiwan Strait. But now it's almost every day, right? And so he was saying that the pressure that China is applying from a military sense in both the South China Sea and in East Asia is like the boiling frog. It's increasing, but as it increases, there's a lot of work to try and normalize it. And that then makes people underestimate what might be the ultimate outcome, which could be conflict, right? And we see that in Australia. You know, we see people go, oh, God, there's an incident again at Second Thomas Shoal. And in that way, I'm sure the Philippines don't view it that way, but in that way, it's kind of normalizing what is not normal behavior, you know, and I think that it's so important on that, you know, boiling frog analogy to keep highlighting that this isn't normal behavior. It isn't complying with UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and numerous other international law treaties. And we can't be accepting it as the norm. And that's why I think, you know, it was good earlier in the year, in March, to actually see the Australian government, as opposed to just the Australian ambassador to the Philippines, come out and condemn China's actions around Second Thomas Shoal. What do you think of the boiling frog analogy?
Yeah, and I was a little surprised, and I would be interested. I've only seen the media reporting of it rather than the full comments themselves, because when Aquilino spoke to the Lowy Institute, must have been earlier this month, no, last month, he actually was, whilst he was still very much sort of highlighting the challenges and the issues caused by China in the region, he was slightly more sort of playing down or minimising, but highlighting that certain things are actually improving, like improved particularly in terms of sort of the dangerous incidents, both in the skies and in the seas, particularly from the PLAM perspective, rather than necessarily Chinese Coast Guard and Maritime Militia. So I was slightly surprised at the, I guess, the strength of the statement, and that, as I say, could be just to do with the bit that gets picked up by the media. You never quite know. I think it unquestionably fits into the wider trends that we're seeing, whether it is this week's Scarborough Shoal or elsewhere. It is almost, it will be every week, I suspect, on this podcast, we'll be talking about something around this. And in terms of normalising, I think one of the things that really sort of came out to me this week was about this sense of normalising things like the use of water cannon.
Yes.
And this question about the degree to which that is it the use of force? When you look at the force actually being projected onto these ships, which is doing things like bending steel and causing very significant damage to electronics, equipment, everything else, there has to, at some stage, be a question raised about what is a use of force. If ramming is not and using water cannon is not, there are questions there, and this behaviour, as you say, is being normalised, and that is really, really problematic, and something I think probably most of our listeners will agree that we need to push back on.
No, completely agree. I did note that in the Financial Times interview that I read, he did mention the fact that, I think between September 21 and September 23, the US released 180 or 200 incidents of close shaves between their aircraft and the PLAF. And he did mention that there's almost been no incidents like that this year. So that's important, right? And there are positives. I think those things don't make the headlines, but they, things in some areas are improving. But I think it's important to remember that, I don't think the Philippines views that the relationships are improving when they see what's happened around Scarborough Shoal this week.
No, absolutely not. In terms of moving on, talking about capability, what's grabbed your attention this week?
Yeah, right. So a couple of interesting things. Nothing about lasers, so not quite that interesting. But China's commenced sea trials of their new aircraft carrier, which I will pronounce incorrectly, and I apologise. I'm going to call it the Fujian. Right, so China's done that. They have just commenced their sea trials for their largest ever aircraft carrier. So it's about 20,000 tons or so larger than its previous two aircraft carriers, and quite a different design. So the previous two first one was actually acquired from Russia. The second one was based on a Russian design. This is a Chinese design, so different catapults and things like that. But it does just kind of reinforce how much the PLAN is dramatically improving in terms of its capability. And I think eventually, once we see this third aircraft carrier operational, then you are going to start to see greater ranges of aircraft carrier deployment. We haven't seen one through the Malacca Strait to the Indian Ocean, but I think that we're probably not too far from seeing that, to be honest. So I think not only is their capability improving, but we will be seeing the way they operate dramatically changing. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think it's part of a slow, ongoing process that we've expected for some time. And I have seen some reporting, and I've not actually confirmed it, that there's also suggestions of long lead items and things being acquired for the fourth carrier.
Yep.
So this is part of a further development of unquestionably at least the second most powerful blue water navy. At the moment, it's notable that whilst they have the kind of capability of a blue water navy, broadly speaking, certainly in terms of the kit one would expect, they don't really operate like a full blue water navy to that sort of degree. And we have to expect that to change. You don't build these kind of platforms if you don't want to use them in the kind of the open ocean and to project power over long distance. So that is definitely going to change. I think that it seems obvious quite what these things are for. I think still remains there's sort of a number of different schools and people will continue to debate this. But I think all we can really do is sit and watch and see how these sort of developments play out. But it's a serious force that they're building, and it's going to have a very significant effect on our region. There's no doubt about that.
There's lots about shipbuilding, which I know you love. Do we want to talk about shipbuilding?
Why not? Why not? Let's talk about shipbuilding. So obviously, the big news in terms of Australian shipbuilding is the ongoing saga, Austal-Hanwha saga. So this question about whether or not the very large Korean shipbuilder and wider kind of industrial conglomerate Hanwha are going to acquire Austal. Now, this has been something that's sort of been in the works for a little while, has been pushed back by Austal largely on the basis that they may sort of said that it was clear that both the Australian government and the American government would veto any such takeover. Now, Richard Marles rather threw cat amongst the pigeons earlier this week when he suggested that the Australian government might not view things in that kind of way. Which has then raised a whole host of further questions, particularly about the acquisition and selection of design for the new general purpose frigates. One of the frigates is the Daegu FX Batch 2 is a Hanwha design, and so the other competitors are obviously viewing this as a potential issue, and then there are further potential issues that if Hanwha does acquire Austal, then the other competitors wouldn't want their designs being built in a Hanwha yard. So there's a whole host of issues that are then come from this sort of this problem that is at the centre of this, which is kind of over the future of Austal. What did you make of this, and what did you make of Miles's comments, both in relation to Austal and the wider kind of frigate program?
Look, I think they're interesting, but I think they're not surprising. So if you look back to the Defence Industrial Strategy, the DID, that was released by Pat Conroy earlier this year, and you look at the definition of sovereign in there, it's very clear that the current government is trying to move away having things so tied to very discrete rules about what is Australian, right? Now, there's going to be a lot of people who run small to medium enterprises in defence industry who are very upset about this. And I'm not an expert on SME enterprises. But you can see the government is realising that to accelerate certain large capabilities, they need to be a little bit more liberal in the definition of sovereign. So I don't have the definition in front of me, but I think the DID strategy says basically to be a sovereign Australian company, you just need to have an Australian ABN, right? Which is pretty easy to do. So given that context and the way that the government seems to be thinking about these things, I wasn't surprised to see the Defence Minister say he doesn't see a specific issue with it. And a lot of people will get very emotive about sovereign capability and what that means. I'm not necessarily so driven by those things. I think it is interesting to see companies such as Hanwha, which I had the figures a couple of weeks ago. I can't remember now, but basically with Hanwha, with Hyundai, with the big shipbuilders in Korea, they have managed to make Korea in the last 20 years one of the biggest shipbuilders, if not the biggest, depends on the quarter, in the world, right? And they are pumping out military vessels. They are exporting them to different countries. So if we were to look at our capability for shipbuilding and learn some lessons or get some tips from them, and if that's through a Hanwha takeover of Austal, without seeing the details, right, because a lot of this rests on the actual details, then I don't think that we should be necessarily so dramatically opposed to it. It does obviously create issues for the general purpose frigate down select, which where 3 months post the independent analysis team's recommendations coming out. So in 9 months, hopefully less, the government needs to make a decision on which of the 4 frigates. And we know last year the government signed their strategic shipbuilding agreement with Austal. Now that didn't lock Austal into building the general purpose frigate, but it makes sense that Austal will probably build the general purpose frigate. So look, I think there's lots in it. There's a lot of people who are very emotive and very upset, but I think there's a lot of pros to it too. So I'm not closed off to the idea.
So we're going to move on to our Did You Know section. This week we're going to be talking, going back into the archive a little bit, and talking about the Radford-Collins Agreement, which is something that often gets a kind of a mention. Most people don't really know that much about what actually it is and where it comes from. And so we thought we'd have a little bit of a quick overview. So Radford-Collins is very much a Cold War era agreement, early Cold War agreement, and comes out of the sort of difficult relationship in some ways between Australia and the United States in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when the Australians were desperate to get the Americans involved, and the Americans were not actually overly keen. And so the origins of the agreement itself actually start with something called ANZAM, which is an agreement between Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, largely focused on protecting Malaya. And as part of ANZAM, the ANZAM forces committed to protecting shipping in this region, so sort of particularly the Indian Ocean region, but also into Southeast Asia and beyond. And it was this commitment to protect shipping in the region that then drove the Americans to accept that they needed a kind of a coordinating framework to work out and kind of delineate where American responsibility ended and where ANZAM responsibility began. And the real focus in this is on trade protection and ASW across the wider, I guess, what we now call Indo-Pacific. They still had the Indo-Pacific back then, they just didn't call it that. So not that much has changed in some ways. And so what you see is an agreement drawn up between John Collins, who was the Australian Chief of Naval Staff, and Admiral Arthur Radford, who was the Commander-in-Chief US Pacific Fleet in March 1951 in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor. And they basically carve up what is now the Indo-Pacific. And they have a line which starts at the Thai-Cambodian border and goes down in kind of steps through maritime Southeast Asia, so sort of south of the Philippines, and then out into the Central Pacific, and then down into the Southern Ocean, sort of beyond New Zealand. And this is about separating out the separate roles. It's quite important to remember that this is not a treaty, so this isn't ANZUS. It's something quite different. It's much more of an operational kind of agreement. And that Collins at the time represented more than just Australia, so he was representing the entire of ANZAM. But I think it's really interesting, not least because of the way it frames this newish relationship between the Royal Australian Navy and the US Navy, or the changing relationship, I guess, with Australia taking the fore. And it also really highlights the critical importance of kind of sea control and trade protection to the RAN in this period. And I would argue more broadly the RAN, this is something that the RAN does, although we don't necessarily always talk that much about it. And so I think it's a really important agreement and something that's worth understanding, not least because lots of these issues around responsibility, trade protection, etc., haven't gone away. They've definitely changed, but they're still very much there and are likely to remain there well into the future.
Thanks, Rich. I think it's a really interesting agreement. I note that so Joanne Wallace and Beck Stratting, if you're watching, hi, their new book, Girt by Sea, which I've got to give a plug to, actually talks about this agreement as well. I find it interesting, when I think about the potential for conflict in the region, which, hopefully does not occur, but there are increasing indicators that it is, although not probable, not unlikely. What would be the relationship between the US and Australia, and what would be Australia's role? And I think that in some ways, the Radford-Collins Agreement, the focus on protection of trade and sea control. I think that's a little bit instructive in terms of where the Australian Navy might find itself being tasked. And certainly, I read a lot of things that talk about the Australian Navy, the very small Australian Navy, being up threat in the Taiwan Strait and all this stuff. And my view is it's completely laughable. You think about the delineation of responsibilities in Radford-Collins Agreement. You think about the increased force posture initiatives in Australia with the US. You think about how dependent Australia is on trade or seaborne supply as it would be in a conflict. And you can see some very obvious roles for the Royal Australian Navy in the event of conflict in the region. And so I think, the Radford-Collins Agreement is kind of the start of thinking about that delineation.
Absolutely. And hopefully some more people will have a look at it and start to think a bit more seriously about what some of those kind of roles are, because I think one of the big challenges at the moment in the current debate over a range of things, but most notably AUKUS, is some slightly intriguing concepts as what it is that Australia and the Royal Australian Navy in particular might be there to do.
Well, I'm going to give a shameless plug. I don't know when, but I do have a piece coming out with the Fin Review in the next couple of weeks, a long-form piece that talks exactly about AUKUS and the delineation of responsibilities and what are the realistic roles we think our submarines might be playing in the event of a conflict. So keep an eye out for that.
Well, sounds like we've got some excellent things to be looking forward to. I'm sure there'll be lots more happening in the coming week in maritime affairs. Certainly this week, once again, it has confirmed that, as ever, Maritime Matters. We had to get it in there somewhere, right?
We did. Maritime Matters.
So, and on that note, I think we'll say thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back again next week to talk more about things that are happening in the maritime domain.